Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. So I'm going to introduce Dave Collings. I could talk for a long time about Dave, both his intellectual generosity and his remarkable intelligence, but we're in hurry up mode. So I'll simply say that Dave is professor of English at Bowdoin. From that northern fastness, he has authored 4 books and many, many articles on Romanticism, critical theory, and climate change. Of those books, I'll note especially the second one, Monstrous Society, as perhaps of particular interest for this group. That book extends E.P. Thompson's Customs in Common in order to theorize Romantic era notions of the monstrous, think of Frankenstein, for example, as a symptom of the way that social reciprocity had broken down.
Thanks to everyone for inviting me. Thank you, Colin. Thank you for the invitation, CCA, everything. This will be fun. I am looking forward to this. I especially am grateful that I was asked to participate by teaching poetry that in some ways theorizes itself. This is something I try occasionally in my classes, and I really like that experiment. I like that approach. So we'll see how it works with Claire. So I just gave you the poems themselves. Mostly they are what we call the enclosure elegies, lamentations over specific sites that have been changed by enclosure, and also about his shift from one location to another partway through his life. But let me first set the historical and conceptual, the broader political context for Claire, and then I'll jump in and make a few points about Claire that might get us started. This is a little unusual. We typically think of this period in England as shaped by industrialization, by the great industrial takeoff, by the beginnings of socialism, precursors to Marx, the emergence of David Ricardo, and so on. All of that is true, but Claire gives us another side of the period because he is rooted in the agricultural life of the countryside, and he reminds us that almost all the discourse of that period, if you go back to the late 19th century radical discourse, if you look at Thomas Paine's Agrarian Justice, if you move up through Ricardo's own classical political economy, if you look at people like Cobbett and his massively influential journalism, Thomas Spence, an early radical socialist, the Chartists, all of them think in agrarian terms. And all of them think with some reference to the commons or common right. So we easily forget that there was a whole discourse prior to Marx and prior to the industrial ascendancy, which was rooted in the commons, the actual commons, agrarian commons. So Claire is a great voice for that era and that perspective. This is very especially significant because this was the highest rate of enclosures in England, in English history. There was a significant rate in the 17th century. It moderated a bit, and then it really took off in this era, late 18th through the first decades of the 19th century. So it was, and everyone knew it, and it was very visible, and it was a major element of the public sphere. And it was also tied up with the transformation of the premises of collective life, the overturning of old norms of reciprocity. As Colin mentioned, that's a major focus of my work in Monstrous Society. The assumption that everyone should be subjected to the market and to wage labor, the hostility to those who could have only a partial interest in a waged income because they had access to commons or to other sources of support. The assumption was those people are lazy. They don't know how to labor. They're not really part of the modern world. The arrival of new theories of how to manage people using weapons of the wage, which required a whole series of parliamentary moves, legislation, new policies, new regulations, all kinds of, it was basically a concerted political effort to remove people from the land. It was not by any means an organic development from within English economic relations. Modernity in England happened, you might say the Enlightenment happened in England through the forced removal of people from the land, through the overturning of the commons. So as you might well imagine, this led to a very strong response from commoners and from other plebeians and ordinary people in what we might call traditionalist radicalism. The claim that common right, that the land, that traditional practices had preserved aspects of the lives of ordinary people. And the abrogation of those norms then was a radical act. And they wanted to restore a prior condition and to make more visible the premises of that prior condition. Ironically, what that led to, for example, in the last weeks of Cobbett's life, he had been arguing all along for common right and for reciprocity. He eventually gave up on ever attempting to persuade the gentry to restore common right. So in one of his last messages, he decided he agreed with Thomas Spence. He became a socialist. Socialism in many ways is rooted in traditionalist radicalism. Again, it's not an account we typically come across. So all of this is in the background, but Clare himself, of course, goes a bit further because he himself is a plebeian worker, an agricultural laborer, which is unusual in the English poetic canon. He speaks for and from the actual landscape of the commons. What this means is that his approach to all these questions is not within the realm of economics or political thought or socialism, etc. It's a vivid, embodied landscape through which he walked, in which he worked. And for a big part of his life, it was in Helpston, a specific commons. The irony is that Helpston was enclosed early in his life, and he secured employment as one of the people who actually did the work of enclosing the commons himself. That's a very dark irony of his life. However, the fact he is embodied and looking at the question of the commons through the landscape means that for him, the commons is also a non-human space of thriving. Animals, birds, trees, stones, grasses, weeds, etc. And this already overleaps many of the terms of the commons that we're used to in the socialist tradition, because it hints at an ecosystems approach and animal rights approach, etc. Many of the concerns of more recent decades are already there in Clare. So if we hone in a little bit more on Clare's actual writing, I'd like to make a few points. One is that the language and approach sometimes have resonances of the British popular radical tradition, especially the ballad tradition. Certain kinds of songs that rally people against the dominant regime are echoed in Clare's work, but indirectly. So there is a kind of encryption that takes place. Clare is not directly or visibly an agitator, a rioter, etc. He doesn't play those roles. He is unusual, though, because he brings something to the tradition that was not found there typically without him, the actual voice of a commoner. To some extent, he remains deferential to the gentry, to his publisher, to members of his audience, to his patrons, and so on. But he also wants to fight back against them. He wants to secure his own voice. He doesn't want to be pigeonholed as a peasant poet as he was. He doesn't want to edit out certain passages as some of his editors wished him to do. He wants to fight back and to remain a plebeian voice, which again is very rare and not entirely deferential, although somewhat so. So what you have in him is an actual politics of the commons voiced from below, from the world of the commons. This leads to a whole series of questions that we can get at further later on, but it does have, especially in Lament of Swati Well, very strong overtones of the radical poetic tradition. One of the things to mention is that his cosmology, if we want to call it that, his religion, may come through when he speaks of the grass eternal, and how it is coeval with Adam's race. This is the language of the old radical tradition, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was a gentleman. A deep suspicion of class, of artifice, of cities, of civilization, of anything that arises that distinguishes itself from what is radically shared in common. So his aesthetics, his politics may come through best in lines like that, a kind of universalism that anticipates Whitman. All of us are rooted in a world defined by the grass, which will come back. Everything is in ruins. This, of course, is in some sense a metaphor that's not necessarily an ecosystems approach, but it is quite revealing of his overall political stance. So if we take his aesthetics of grass and his speech as a plebeian, and we put them together, we get moments like we see in Remembrances when the moles are being hanged from the trees. A poem of great outrage and of real radical affect. I think that that moment when he comes across the hanged moles resonates with the rage of radicals who saw some of their number hanged after public protests. And the very harsh response to a whole series of radical movements by the British state in the early 19th century, one of which would be the response of the state to the swing riots in 1830, which took over parts of England where Clare lived. In Remembrances, there is even a passage on page 260. It says, "Enclosure like a Buonaparte came." So to talk about enclosure as a Buonaparte, as an invasion, as a military, warlike, violent event that associates the local and the commons with England, in effect, he's just saying that there has been a takeover, a colonization, an occupation of the landscape by a hostile power, that it's already taken place. Again, we see a strong traditionalist radicalism here. We see the sense that the commons or the place has been destroyed, but so has the commons as an idea, as a political reality. It's been overwhelmed by something hostile. Lament of Swati Well does many of these things and goes even further when he personifies the space speaking. He abandons himself as a speaker and has the place speak, and how it has been, they've turned it over, they've picked its very bones. Here the place is the commons, in perhaps the most radical displacement of our typical understanding of commons. Of course, it's fallen upon the town. That means it can no longer subsist on its own, so it must live at the workhouse, it must rely on public charity. So in that moment, Clare evokes the social realities of early 19th century England, with a vast number of citizens who were reduced to living off of public welfare payments, basically, because of the high cost of living during the Napoleonic Wars. A feature to mention also, that no doubt you saw in some of these enclosure elegies, is Clare's lament for having moved from one place to another. Early in the 1830s, one of his patrons arranged for him to live in better quarters in another town about 2 miles away from Helpston. And so he took the offer and he did make the move, but he felt absolutely confused by it because the fields and trees and landscapes immediately surrounding him were not the ones he knew throughout the rest of his previous years. So in The Flitting, for example, and in other poems, he talks about how it's vague, unpersonifying things that surround him now. Even the sun doesn't look like the sun. Even the paths have lost their way. One of the things that we see here is that Clare's poetics, he traces to his intimacy with place. So when he shifts from one place to another, he worries that his own capacity to write poetry may disappear. So decay a ballad refers to how poetry is on the wane, as Meredith referred to at the start. So there are many things we can look at and work with here. There's another reference to his own stance as poet on page 20 in the Lamentation of Round Oak Waters. Early in his career, already he's aware that when other kids were playing collective boisterousness in sports, he was hiding behind a bush writing his poems. So there was a distinctiveness and individualism to Clare. He is part of the commons, and yet he is not. He's the voice of the commons, so that makes him oddly distinct and somehow different from his peers. So the oddness of Clare's life and his own personal situation come to the fore, especially in the enclosure elegies. Okay, moving rapidly ahead. One of the key elements to talk about is the language in which he writes the poems. Sometimes they are quite literary. They have resonances of English poetic forms and dialects and diction, I should say, from the Renaissance on, but there's also a very strong presence of dialect on occasion, so that we see this in the remembrances, for example. What we see then in Clare is a resistance to standard written English, the lingua franca, the common speech that Wordsworth and Coleridge celebrate in their various ways. Clare insists on the locality of speech, on the dialect, on place again. So you could say that he resists the notion that the local is a metonymic relation, part for whole, or one thing for another. The local is an instance of the English, that England is found in each locality. Well, he would say it is there, but it's in a distinct way. Really, England is a patchwork of distinct places, none of which is like the other. Each dialect is distinctive. Each version of the language has its own value and needs to be celebrated. So the hostility to a kind of uniform gentry abstraction that takes the landscape in or summarizes the social order resembles a hostility to a single use of the language that can encompass all the various local usages. So Clare is interested in multiplicity and divergence, and the differend, perhaps we could even say. Okay, so moving ahead to a few last points. What happens after the commons has suffered when, as in the Lament of Swati Well, the hospitality to butterflies and bees and stones has been negated? To some extent, a huge part of Clare's life is dedicated to writing about things that have survived, things that are overlooked and neglected. He has some lines on old neglect, and occasionally in his writing, that he celebrates. He has an ethics of neglect, that is when human beings just overlook or forget about that little bird in that little hollow tree. His fascination with shy animals, with non-human animals that survive in ways that do not accommodate human beings, comes across in hundreds of poems. And in some ways you could say, therefore, the commons survive in those creatures and in their ways of life, despite what has happened to the actual agricultural fields. This dimension of Clare is fascinating, and he clearly identifies with these little shy birds and with these creatures, sees himself perhaps in their form, but he also sees a strong distinction between the human and the non-human. He doesn't want to bridge that gap necessarily. So there is a kind of politics here that is non-human or post-human, that embraces something much vaster than the commons as, say, William Cobbett would define it, or Thomas Spence. And so that leads me to my last set of questions, which would be on page 260 in Remembrances. Clare regrets the plow and suggests that maybe it would be better if the landscape had not been torn up for agricultural purposes. So there's a resistance not only to enclosure, but to the human use of the land. And we can see this as well in his celebration of weeds. Weeds, of course, is an abusive term for any plant that agriculturalists don't want to retain. To celebrate weeds is to kind of express one's hostility to agricultural practices. So, and in Decay, a Ballad, he refers to something that is more than Eden's, in effect, something prior to Eden, that would be prior to a garden, to a space cultivated for the pleasure of human beings. So one almost reaches the state here where the commons, as an ethics, as an approach, overleaps the human context and becomes a rather different thing, a domain which contests the commons itself as a space of agricultural labor. Okay, I should stop there.
I might just start by, I'm fascinated by the post-human aspects of the later poems, and I wondered how you squared that with the spaces in the earlier poems, Round Oak Waters and Swati Well, that with personification and the way that the natural world speaks. Particularly in Round Oak Waters, it's really fascinating how so much of the poem gets taken over by the voice of the natural world, and then the speaker then becomes the double. Or the watchful waiter along with the brook. So could you just speak a little bit to that complexity?
Great, Meredith. Yes, thank you. It's interesting to look at I think maybe Swati Well has gotten more attention lately than Round Oak Waters. But Round Oak Waters is also a fascinating example. And in some ways, it's a little bit different because Round Oak Waters remembers Claire when he used to visit and how he behaved when he was a kid. And, there's a kind of, he's a friend. It's like, or it's a friend. Round Oak Waters is even more personified and humanized here than Swati Well would be. There's also a sense in which Round Oak Waters, even though it has grievous murmurs, isn't quite as down on its luck as Swati Well. So Swati Well has a more truly distinct presence and a greater degree of rage and of depletion. Round Oak Waters is so in some ways it raises even further questions. And a lamentation, it's still pretty sharp enough on page 21, line 93, but now alas, my charms are done. It's been turned upside down as well. The box and eddies are no more, pastures too are gone. So it's a genuine lament. So I think the fundamental question you're asking, Meredith, the interesting question, difficult question is, what happens when a poet attempts to create a strong response to non-human presence through personification in this way? And this also raises that question that I mentioned earlier in the flitting when Claire says, this landscape is full of vague, unpersonifying things, as if for him, landscapes should be personifying. That means it's a real landscape that you can really respond to it. So using that last line from the flitting here, I'm going to cheat a little bit, Meredith. The implication is that for Claire, landscapes become persons if you live with them long enough and you invest emotion in them long enough that they become as real to you as human beings, even though they are not human beings, in which case they can speak to you, they remember you. If your life is lived through your response to them, then they contain whatever you are. Thus, in Round Oak Waters, the landscape remembers him, knows him, understands him, is him. This is a kind of projection, obviously, but it works in an interesting way because for Claire, what happens to the fields and the birds and the moles is happening to him.
My question's about scale. So you have given us a really great set of images of the intense localism, the kind of place-based thinking. It was partly in your answer to Meredith too, but you said England is a patchwork of distinct places, and just in general that hostility to abstraction, which of course is in other poets in the period in different ways, even urban poets like Blake, but there's a particular way in which Claire works this out. And so there's that, and then another coming at that from a different angle, there's the just intense individualism. The special child writing poetry while everybody else is playing games, that kind of voice that comes, so that he is of the commons, but in a sort of different way. So given those two things, just like the radical place-based particularism and the individualism, how do you think about scale with the commons?
That's a fabulous question. And I should have been thinking a bit more theoretically about angles into that question to which we have access. Mostly what I'm thinking at the moment are the skeptical responses many of us have had to, say, the local global, think locally, act globally, whatever, think globally, act locally, that ease of movement between these terms, or the ease of a critique that says, okay, the investment in the individual actually is an abstraction because this individual is presumably any person. And so there's a universalism already embedded in the individual. The same thing could be with place. Okay, we love the place. Why do we care about the place? Because any place we care about. So immediately the ethical relation to the individual, the place, etc., is really just another abstraction, and we're right back where we started. So to get outside of that, it takes a little bit of work. How do we do the scalable, as you say, Colin, if we are within the particular and the distinctive and the dialect, etc.? I guess I would call upon a number of recent efforts. One would be Jean-Luc Nancy in Being Singular Plural, which is an attempt to look at how divergently individuals can be. even within a plurality? Is there a singular? Is there something that is shared within that plurality? Very much in a theoretical mode, it doesn't apply to the Clare context so well. Or Giorgio Agamben, The Coming Community, where he builds on a series of different discourses to talk about the quiditas, the whatness of things that is intrinsic to them, rather than some other philosophical categories. I think those are good resources for us. Thinking historically, perhaps would be closer to Clare. If we think of the commons less as an abstract right, maybe I'll back up. Actually, in Monstrous Society, I do theorize some of this directly. The shift from common right or from plebeian access to the public sphere through various randomly organized customs to the demand for the right to vote, which we're used to, or to constitutional rights, which are truly universal and abstractions. That shift is a significant one. And it only really occurs because, as I suggested, aspects of the commons were under attack in the period. So you could say modernity arrives when people begin to think about individuals and localities, et cetera, in abstract terms in order to defend them against the activities of capitalism and of dominant forces. Those abstractions are very costly and in some ways actually give away the whole game. So to undo that, do we go back to a pre-modern mode? Perhaps what we should do is retrieve aspects of the pre-modern, which were unregulated, random, fairly chaotic, untheorized, not codified by law, except perhaps in the common law, and retrieve that multiplicity and that unevenness, that confusion as a positive element, where it takes work of translation from one dialect to another. It takes the difficulty of mutual comprehension through a medium which is not transparent. It takes conceiving of the commons not as a general right, but as locally specific customs. I think Clare is on the side of this approach. So in some ways, we can only scale it up through the difficult work of conceiving of modes of relationship across divergence within a general umbrella that this is still not England's, not Napoleon, not Bonaparte, that is a general umbrella that protects this diversity and this unevenness. Admittedly, though, this is not a fully thought out answer.
This exchange has more or less answered my question, which was simpler and more hostile to begin with. But you did a yeoman's job staying within the agrarian framework in widening the frame where Clare is concerned. But this is just a Clare commonplace, and with mental health issues sort of super added to it. But there is a kind of pathological provincialism in locality, and it's almost as if with every attempt to widen the frame, Clare wants to narrow it.
I will just answer in part by underlining what you said, Billy, the episode in the autobiography when he decides he's going to take a big walk and look for the edge of the world. So he lights out and he walks more miles than he's used to in one particular direction. And, eventually it's a crisis for him. And he really does think that he's in some ways going to reach the edge of the world if he walks 10 miles in a given direction or something. So this is pathological for us in modernity, but we need to think of this historically as well. The whole idea of nostalgia comes into existence in the era of the Napoleonic Wars, and we need to remember that pre-modern people in many cases never did travel more than 10 or 15 miles from the place of their birth throughout their entire lives. So it's an actual historical practice. It's an embodied reality that vast percentage of people who lived in the landscape in pre-modern, early modern Europe and England were like Clare. For them, reality derived from a particular space. It's interesting to theorize this through Eliada's theory of space in his work on ritual and religion, or through Heidegger on dwelling, building dwelling thinking, and so on, to play with these ideas philosophically and religiously. In Claire's case, I think, Billy, you're completely right. It was pathological because eventually his shift to Northborough from Helpston, it was only 4 or 5 years later, even less than that, when he began to have symptoms of mental disturbance, and he actually did end up in an asylum. So I actually do think that there was a sense in which he lost his way. He kind of lost his grip on reality after that move. So this gets into questions of patronage. Why did he actually accept this new dwelling place? Why did he go for the largesse of this patron? And so on. So I guess I will just go with you, Billy, here in part and suggest that this is, for him individually, a real devastating blow, this shift from one scene to another. But that, to then go one more step, we can say that there is a history to pathology. There is a history to mental disturbance, of which he is a major symptom, as is also the emergence of the idea of nostalgia in the period. The idea that we should be uprootable, that we should be migratory, that we should travel, that we should see many landscapes and scenes. I will close by referring to Nietzsche and how Nietzsche laments at one point early in his work that, say, students in Swiss universities are no longer surprised by any ideas they come across, because they're used to being introduced to new ideas routinely, rapidly, as a matter of course. So everything in modernity, there's a constant flow of new, novel, crazy possibilities, and becomes just part of a tedious, ever-flowing system of introductions. And Nietzsche laments this and wishes that we were still capable of surprise. What we have is the sort of opposite extreme of someone so fascinated by one scene that just a tiny dislocation surprises him too much. So I think this is part of a vast dialectic that emerges in the 19th century that brings us back to the question of an ethics of place. If we really care about place, then we would care about the disturbance that comes over us if we have to move from place to place. And we very seldom actually care about that.
I guess I would like to see if you could decouple tradition, right, the resources of traditional thought from this weddedness to the local and the particular. Like, I mean, I was thinking about the customary rights of settled tenants to take fuel, for example, from the commons, right? Like, I mean, one of Winstanley's big bugbears, right, is that those customary rights of settled tenants, like, I mean, that those were used against those who were mere inhabitants, and particularly newcomers, right? And yet I think the resources of just traditional Christian thought were completely adequate, right, to include whatever stranger.
I guess I would start with the old notion of, the Garrett Hardin essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, which completely misunderstands the commons and has been refuted dozens of times. As a result, a truly ignorant essay, nevertheless, is revealing, because, and going back to some of the great scholarship on the commons, the reason strangers were excluded is that there was only a certain number, community that could actually subsist on a particular plot of land. If you want to put it nakedly, you can't just let a lot of people enter into that space if it already has a working ecosystem that relies on limited use. Right. So what Winstanley is doing is fascinating and powerful, and is very modern in the sense of creating a discourse using the scriptures to assert a common right in the land, which is continuous with many of the other people I mentioned in the Romantic period, and which is much more standard discourse, and is obviously there behind socialism and Marx and so on all the way through. So Claire is the odd person out here.
I see. Yeah.
And it's interesting.
When Stanley's not happy with the subsistence framework. Yeah.
Well, and Winston, Yeah, and he's going much further. He's talking about land that no one has occupied and that is not being used, etc., which of course also was a major element in the Ricardian era. There was explicit theorization of what happens when you take over new fields and how you use them and how economies of diminishing returns when you take over land that's less and less arable and so on. It's an enormously powerful dimension of the period. Expanding the base during the Napoleonic Wars, because England suddenly had to rely on itself for its grain produce. So it had to greatly expand its agricultural produce, etc. So, and this also could lead to radical notions that people should be, if there is unused land, you should go out and be able to farm it yourself, which is a Lockean, and there are hundreds of things going on here. So the more Burkean settled customary mode, the local, these people can glean, and these people can go get brush in the woods, and these people can farm their cow there, and so on, is pre-modern. It doesn't give you a sweeping discourse of common right. However, it gives honor to an ecosystems approach.
Right.
So what we're stuck between is, how do we frame, which is fundamentally a human-centered economic and political model that we get from Winston Lee and others, and even if it's biblical, how do we frame that so it recognizes the limitations of productivity of a given landscape and the rights of all the creatures that are living there? We don't have very many discourses that try to put those two together until basically the red-green alliances of recent decades, right? And the reappropriation of the idea of the commons for pretty innovative political thinking, like the environmentalist dimensions of Marx, et cetera, lots of other recent work. That's where we might finally get to a useful approach. I think maybe I should correct that and say there were late 19th century thinkers who were beginning some of this work, like Richard Jefferies and others, or William Arch when he tried to unionize farm labor. So there are various places along the way in the late Victorian era where we see anticipations of this. But this is, I think, what we don't have is a bridge between the two. So Joanna, I would just say we need to theorize the shift or the move between people who were embodied exemplars of the customs of the common in the E.P. Thompson mode, and the language of commons, the radical language of the commons, which we get in Winston Lee and beyond.
Dave, you just mentioned the genealogy, the emergence of this coinage, this concept of nostalgia during the Napoleonic Wars. And I've always been puzzled by that, because nostos is the Greek word for the home place. So when I have neuralgia, it's my nerves that hurt. So when you've got nostalgia, what if it was the actual home place that has the pain? And that just flashed into view again as you made that cross reference. So it's really just a comment offered in gratitude for a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Eric. That's great. Maybe I'll just riff on some of the things you said. Yes, what if it's the home place that's in pain? What if you're standing in your home place and you can sense its pain? What if you can try to voice the pain of that landscape now that the landscape has been devastated at Swati Well? So yeah, you're helping us riff on the particular personification that happens in that poem. And if I will just continue with that, because I love that poem, and I would like to point to a couple more things about it. The poem in some ways is lamenting the fact it can no longer be a home. Should the price of grain get high, Lord help and keep it low, I shan't possess a single fly or get a weed to grow. There's a lament that it has lost the capacity for hospitality even to a fly. That in its space, I shan't possess a yard of ground to bid a mouse to thrive. So hyperbole really becoming quite acute here, but the sense that it's an absolutely devastated, ruined space. I've scarce the room to say sit down, and so they wander by. This is page 151 of the handout. The inability to provide refuge or resource or subsistence to anyone. The sense of having lost the capacity to enable anyone else to thrive. It is almost as if Claire has felt his way into the position of a landscape's lament. If we can imagine an ethical and caring, generous landscape having been deprived of its capacity to participate in affairs in this way, it's a space of dispossession and so on. So this is a kind of poem of nostalgia, the pain of the home. Now, of course, it's Claire's, it isn't where he grew up. This isn't Helpstone, it's nearby. But it is a kind of, the pain of Claire as well. But yes, as you started, Eirik, it's a reversal of the personification because it speaks to him as, the landscape can personify him. So it's a reciprocal personification. This may help us a little bit understand reciprocity. One arguably would have to argue that we can only really enter into symbolic relations with the other, with the non-human other, if we're capable of treating that non-human other in some personifying way. But we also would say that the reciprocity is itself what enables us to view ourselves as human, that it's the other that gives us the status of the human. Just as when someone else buries us after we die, that means we're not just a bunch of bones lying on the ground somewhere. We've been conferred a status within the human community, or when we are given a name at birth. So our human status is bestowed by someone else, something else. So what Claire is doing perhaps is extending that, as archaic societies in general did. This is an old tradition. This is a fundamental practice all the way back that modernity has forgotten. Landscapes are personifying us all the time.
I'm delighted to welcome our fourth and final speaker to this event, Juliana Spahr. Juliana is a professor of English at Mills College. She's both a scholar and a poet. Her scholarly books include Everybody's Autonomy, Connective Reading and Collective Identity, and most recently, Du Bois's Telegram, which explores how state interests have shaped US literature, asking if art can ever truly be autonomous, ever truly be revolutionary. In short, it is a book that soberly assesses literature's vexed place in political movements. She's also a poet. Her book, That Winter the Wolf Came, published by Commune Editions, is poetry for global anti-colonial and anti-carceral struggle, a ferocious and lyrical book about oil spills, tear gas canisters, parenting in the age of ecological and economic collapse.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Kristen. And thanks for having me. This has been totally fun. I heard the Commons, not as a space where you take your sheep and let them graze with other people's sheep, but as community, which I guess that is a form of community too. But so I gathered together some poems that I think have some things to say about crowds, more specifically political crowds, sometimes called uprisings, sometimes called riots, sometimes called insurrections, which are also thus about public spaces and are about commons somewhat then. And then I want to start with Fanon, which is I think the second one, the second one in that PDF. And I should have given you the entire essay, but instead I just gave you this poem, African Dawn by Fodiba Kiata. And Fanon quotes this poem in On National Culture, which is an essay that's from The Wretched of the Earth. But he first presents it as the second President's African Conference, the one that was held in Rome in 1959. So it's an attempt to think, as that conference was, to try to think about like, what's the role of culture in this kind of moment, a moment in which many, there's a lot of decolonization happening among various African nations and things are being reconfigured. In this essay, which if you haven't read it, I'm just going to give you a brief summary of it. Fanon talks about what culture looks like in colonization, noticing first that colonization destroys cultural traditions, and then kind of the attempts to kind of rethink cultural production that come out of these decolonization movements. So he presents what I kind of think of as an aesthetic rubric, in which I've kind of presented it. I'm going to share screen as a funny chart, because I love a good funny chart that is there. that he has it. And he locates these like 3 stages of like the native intellectual. You can see them here, like the first stage is an assimilating stage, where the kind of presumed reader or the presumed consumer is the colonizer. It's the moment when poets rhyme and painters paint still lives. There's a kind of use of European forms, and it has, this work has no tom-toms in it. And then he goes on to the remembering stage, which is kind of addressed both to the colonizer and the colonized at the same time. It's the moment when these oral forms are brought forward. There's like stories, epic songs of the people. The rules are followed of these oral forms. There's often a use of dialect. He locates comedy and farce, which I actually is kind of confusing to me, but whatever. And it has the approach that this kind of form, that this work has to history, is that the past is a long time ago, and that we should praise it. The oldness of Europe is seen as tiresome, and it celebrates young Africa, a place of lyricism and liberty. And Fanon, has this kind of complaint about negritude, and he locates this negritude as an example of this kind of literature, and part for its Pan-Africanism and its non-specificity around various nations. It's an argument that I feel is somewhat fair about some of Negritude's work, but I always want to be like, it's not fair about Césaire's Notebook to Return to My Native Land, because that's the best poem ever and you can't say anything bad about it or I'll fight you around it. But this work uses tom-toms, he says, and he has this whole argument about how it uses stereotypical kind of figures with an expressive mass. They're undifferentiated. The colors obey the rules of harmony. And it's a work that's anti-colonial, but not national. And then the third thing, which is the A+ in the rubric, right? It's the literature for the it's going to tell the colonized how to fight back. It innovates on oral traditions. Epic becomes authentic. It uses drama. It doesn't bother with comedy and farce. It brings these conflicts up to date. So he has like what we're going to speak up happens somewhere else, but it really matters to us, and it helps us to understand where we are today. And it uses differentiated figures. Highway robbers and social vagabonds show up. Figures come to life. Arms tend to be raised from the body. There's a sudden appearance of crowds. And it's clearly anti-colonial and concerned with people's struggles. And then what Fanon does, so he develops this kind of like these 3 stages, and then he drops in this poem, African Dawn. And it's somewhat fascinating, you have to admit, because he puts the whole poem in there, because we're so used to the 3 lines that publishers will let you have of a work when you go into the copyright insanity with them. And African Dawn is this poem from 1949. And Modibo Keita is best known for when he founds this group that's going to become Les Ballets Africains in 1952, which he founds in Paris. And eventually it's going to become the National Ballet of the Republic of Guinea in the 1960s. And the company does these huge tours of Europe and the US that are kind of versions of cultural diplomacy. There's a 170 European city tour in 1954. It comes to the United States and performs on Broadway. But prior to that moment, Keita is a poet and also a performer of poetry. And he publishes this book in 1951 called Poems Africains, and it's banned by many of the colonial governments of French Africa for being too Marxist in 1951. And African Dawn is one of these poems in this book, which might explain in part why Fanon is so interested in it. In 1958, Guinea becomes independent, and Keita, like Senghor, like César, enters into the administration and does a classical thing you should never do, which is he reopens a famous colonial prison. It's a terrible idea. He's eventually arrested by Touré in 1969 and imprisoned and eventually killed in this very same prison that he had responsible for reopening. But what Fanon likes about this, it kind of disappears in some way. There's very little work that's been done on him in English. I mean, I think there's some in French. Although there are these kinds of YouTube videos of the ballet performances that are really fascinating if you're all interested in it. Anyway, Fanon looks at this poem as forward focused, that it's clearly anti-colonial, that it's about people's struggles. It does have tom-toms in it also, and has some of the specificity, right? It's about a very specific figure. It's a poem that begins with the pastoral, that begins at dawn and ends with this massacre in Tarre, which is a massacre that happened in 1944, just at the end of World War II, when a group of conscripts from Africa who are being repatriated, they're being held in Dakar, they're not being paid by the French government. There's a kind of insurrection that happens, and the French army opens fire and kills maybe 300 of them. That's how this poem ends, right? That Manon is killed in that moment. So he's gone to go serve the French. He comes back, he's killed by the French in this moment of kind of like trying to, reclaim something. And culture doesn't save him, right? He cannot dance the dance. And I was kind of interested also in trying to think about this poem next to that Novo poem that Harris had translated, that I was so interested in last week. And I mean, I'd love to kind of talk more about that at some point, although I know very little. But I was interested in that list that he has of what the revolutionary poem does. And it's, anecdotes about revolutionary figures, it's celebrations of revolutionary women, it has cartridge belts and workers and some corn. And Fanon's poem is a very different poem in some way. And so, I mean, that's kind of another kind of way to think about it. Like he's kind of dodged that classic complaint that people have about the kind of like the peasant poetry. Bolaño has that whole chapter again on complaining in Savage Detectives, where they complains about this very same form of poem that Novo's complaining about here. And then, so it's just kind of, again, like this, trying to figure out, like trying to think through what's actually happening in these works. And then going on to like McKay. And I think if you really want to make the argument that poetry has a central role to play in the commons, then If We Must Die is probably the poem for you. It's a poem that first circulated in radical Black and left newspapers. McKay tells us that he wrote it in response to the Red Summer of 1919. It was reprinted at least 4 times that year. Then it gets noticed by the US government, and it shows up in these early Red Scare discussions in Congress, where it's used as, it's considered to be seditious. And the poem has this incredibly long tail. Early 20th century philanthropists are very anxious about riots, and they write all these, after every riot, they write a report about the riot. They write almost the exact same report every time. And they almost always quote McKay's If We Must Die, normally as an example of Black militancy, which makes them anxious. And I feel like anything I can say about this poem has been said before. And to use Fanon's rubric, perhaps unfairly, it's a poem written in European forms, it's a sonnet, but it does really interesting things within the sonnet. It invokes all who must die, which is all of us. It makes us all kinsmen. It's anti-dog. McKay uses the we, and he kind of interestingly stuffs this we into this position of the beloved of the sonnet. So if we understand lyric in that classic way as the way that the poet lover speaks to the beloved, the you that it addresses, the kind of classic version is that Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, where the poet lover says to the beloved, you will live on through my poetry. Instead, the narrator of McKay's poem is calling out to a we, and there is no eternal life, right? There's only this rhetorical invocation, if we must die, and of course we all must, and that's our structural position of people who are going to eventually die, that we should rise up. So it's a kind of wonderful inclusion in that moment. The we is also a kind of like interestingly sliding signifier. The poem doesn't specify that it's written in the Red Summer of 1919, although it was written in it was published in June of 1919, so it's written around those events. And so the we and the kinsmen often become different things at different moments. There's a kind of rumor that seems to be false that Churchill used the poem to argue that the US should enter World War II. But the reason why you could make that argument is because of this unspecified, very inclusive we. And the other thing that's really great about this poem is that, up until the 68 era, it's still a poem that kind of is functioning as a useful poem and in moments of uprising. So the prisoners at Attica write it on the walls during the uprising. Asada Shakur opens her autobiography with a story of reading it to the guards. That moment when she's shot and they take her to the hospital and she's like shackled to the hospital bed, and someone gives her a book of poems, and she talks about reading this poem over and over to the guards to like let them know, what the stakes are. George Jackson quotes it in a letter that he writes to his sister shortly before he ends up also dying. I think like that's kind of like, I think it's just got this kind of like fascinating, somewhat unique history. And then moving from 68 to 68, there's this poem that Gwendolyn Brooks writes, which is Riot. It's a chat book. It's her first book when she comes to political consciousness. As you all probably know, she has this early career where she's the first Black writer to win a Pulitzer. She's very much published in these New York establishment presses. And then she goes to this conference at Fisk where she meets Baraka and others and kind of has this moment of political awakening. She stops publishing with Harper and Row and says that she's only going to let Black presses publish her work. She becomes way more involved in the Black arts movement. And this poem is the first poem that she published after she left Harper and Row. And she wrote it about the Holy Week uprisings after Martin Luther King is shot. And she uses 3 different poetic forms and treats them somewhat like a metaphor, and that she places them beside each other and lets the reader figure out what to do with them, what sort of meaning to make out of them. The first is this narrative of a white figure named John Cabot. It's not a real person. And it doesn't seem, I think like no white people actually died in the Holy Week uprisings in Chicago. The second is a representation of the uprising or the commons. It's disembodied, it's overheard. It has many different contradictory voices within it. And then the poem ends with this kind of section that's a love poem or a lyric in a way that kind of echoes McKay, not an allusion, but an intent. The poem is about what it means to be a we, but a kind of like a coupled we. I've always loved that this is how this poem ends, with a return to a lyric that's not a disavowal of the commons, but mainly a kind of bringing in the lyric into this kind of like thing that she's just set up in this prior section. But it's a poem it doesn't feel like it's a call to action in the way that McKay's is. An interesting side note is that it has the Blackstone Rangers in it. The Rangers were a youth group or a gang, and they actually continue to exist, I think, until the late 80s, when I think a number of them are still in jail because they agreed to provide, I think, some sort of weapon to FBI agents posing as operatives for Gaddafi in the like 80s. But in the 68 moment, they've been given $1 million in riot abatement funds from the US government and various philanthropies, and a kind of church that they use as their kind of clubhouse. The funds were supposedly supposed to be used for job training, and they used them for like classes, like they held drumming classes, and they end up even producing a musical that tours through the United States for about 6 months. But after the Fisk conference, Brooks goes and she starts a poetry workshop for the Rangers that runs at the same time as the practice for the musical. And I'd never know what to do with that information, with the irony that one of the most interesting poems about riot from the 68 era was written inside a very successful riot abatement program. The Rangers they took the mandate to stop the rioting seriously, and they did things like they held dances during the Holy Week and opened up the church for snacks to kind of get people off the streets. And they're credited for keeping their neighborhood safer during that time, like it's seen as a successful program. Although eventually, again, like it shows up, the money's quickly pulled and they go back to other sorts of, criminal selling, agreeing to sell things to FBI operatives later in life. So if we think of McKay as telling us that we should take ourselves to the rioting or the uprising, because if we must die, we should do so as pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back, which I always think of somewhat as that insurrectionary text that everyone knows not to send to their friends before the protest, because if you admit that you're going to the riot and getting arrested, there's a lot more trouble with the law. But Brooks is not at the riot and more observing. Philip Levine also not at the riot, thus the pronoun they that he uses. But it's the same riot of Brooks's poem. It's the Holy Week uprisings. It's a poem that's pro-lion and it's pro-pig too, unlike McKay's poem, which is anti-pig. I actually love the poem for its language, the way it's got ambiguity built into it. We only know that it's a riot because Levine tells us that it is. It isn't really in the poem that much. Another model from '68 is Diane de Prima's Revolutionary Letters. Revolutionary Letters wants us to almost to be a kind of like a poem as a how-to book. So this poem is about, keeping your drugs so that you can help people when they need it. And I'm kind of interested in the question of whether revolutionary letters, how we would score it on that Fanon rubric. Is it a literature of fighting back or not? And then just two other poems more to the contemporary. Thulani Davis, who is like now, I think better known as an academic, but was a poet for a while in the 80s. Again, not at the riot. She tells us that this poem was written in Brooklyn. It's about the LA riots. But I was also interested in the stuff about the kind of like the love showing up. Oh, beautiful, David Hobbs. But not as in McKay and Brooks, where the love poem becomes part of the riot. This time in the songs, it's about the songs that one might be able to listen to if one doesn't go to the riot. And then Sean Bonney, a contemporary poet who's unfortunately now dead, who wants us there with every mundane moment. And I like how this poem opens with a literalization of the kind of things that I think McKay and Brooks and even Davis were trying to work through when that line for I love you, say fuck the police. And that's the end.
There's so much here. Don't even quite know where to dig in. Could you say a little bit more about the Philip Levine poem and its abstraction, the abstraction of the lion, they lion, not his lion. He's not only not at the riot, he's an observer, but it's a different observational stance really than Brooks's, I would think, or Davis's.
Yeah, he doesn't also like it's their lion, right? It's not his lion in some way. I mean, Philip Levine is interesting because he's not like, we kind of understand him as like the kind of like the establishment working poet of the working class in some way, right? And so I think that's part of what I also really like about this poem is it gives us a different kind of Levine in some sense. Joanna Berman has like, it's also like they lie, which is a very funny pun that I've never thought about. And it has the kind of classic, but in some ways it's got the classic establishment, right? It's they, I'm not at it. The story that he tells is that I think it's like that he's working in a metal shop and he's working with someone who's Black, and they're putting bolts in kind of burlap sacks that are marked with like food for the zoo in some sense, and the guy says something about how they feed the lion, the bolts in some way. So it's kind of like, there's still in this kind, there's still this like racial divide or something around it that feels kind of, again, like one of the conventions of this kind of establishment literature that you get in the United States. It's liberal, it's heading to the illiberal or the whatever you want to call that, but it's still very much a kind of like liberal poem. But it's also quite beautiful and interesting and full of weird language.
I guess a first point I'm teaching this course on anti-colonial thought right now. We did national culture chapter yesterday, and it was the first time I'd taught it. So I really wish I had your schema before I had gone into that class. So I found that very compelling way to frame the project, especially the sort of criterion of revolutionary participation as the criterion of what, kind of like makes national consciousness stick in his terms and distinguishes it from something like nationalism. But for Fanon, that's like one phase of a process that points towards what he calls the new humanism. And so my question had to do with how you think about that project of a new humanism, especially in its kind of taking the measure of man in relationship to some of the things that Dave was saying about ecosystems approaches to the commons that maybe tilt towards post-humanist questions and so on. So I'm thinking of like kind of the problem of anti-colonial humanisms as something that might be worth addressing here. Pushing in another direction, I did I guess want to just sort of like ask about maybe again here Dave's paradigm of the sort of, I think you called it the very long dialectic of modernity around place, or complex dialectic, actually makes, I think, poems like McKay's poem and Brooks's poem thinkable in terms of the agrarian problems we've been talking about as well. There is a kind of agrarian dispossession dynamic that is at stake for McKay, who had gone to study with Booker T. Washington briefly before he went to be a porter on the railroad where he wrote that poem, and so on. So so that's one question, is like, is it worth kind of recuperating that dimension of agrarian dispossession in the analysis of the threads you're bringing together? So anyway, those are just a couple things in different directions, but I love this. This is really thought-provoking and helpful. And the riot abatement reading, it kind of blew my mind. That's amazing.
The one about place feels the one that's kind of, I think, really feels like really interesting to kind of think about in that way. I'm trying to think of, I mean, he just, not only does McKay go to, when he leaves, when he goes to Kansas afterwards, right, before he goes and becomes a porter, and there he takes classes in things like insecticides, and like he gets a classic, again, agricultural, I can't even remember what the name of the school is, it's like the Kansas School of Agriculture, and he comes from farmer parents, and that way, and so like, I mean, I think like that question of like, I also had that same moment where I kind of kept thinking about like the agrarian, what that means, like putting it into the United States, what it means that these poems that are, I mean, the Holy Week uprisings are about Martin Luther King being killed, but the tensions that are leading to Martin Luther King being killed are ones about the displacement, as you've noticed, about the Great Migration. And those are the same ones that are causing these like 1919 riots. And so like there's an agrarian or a move away from the agrarianness that's causing these kinds of like intense tensions that are happening in the North that are making all these philanthropists like so nervous at the same time. And they're somewhat about kind of like the failed, like the way that Reconstruction is not allowed to succeed, and there's not allowed to be these kinds of like return to a land like the 40 acres and the mule doesn't work, like it's just like, Jim Crow comes along. And so I don't really know what to say other than that it seems like this kind of thing that's underneath there.
My relationship to some of this more contemporary radical poetry is one of almost like escapism, right? The like totality of austerity and neoliberalism is so horrible that you read this and you feel like maybe something is possible. And then in the summer of 2020, you started to see Sean Bonney's lines and Tongo Eisen-Martin's lines on signs written on subway cars in New York City. And I wonder if the porousness of this contemporary form offers something different, or what it is that like McKay's highly controlled formal poetics maybe says to the portability of the more open poetics that we see circulating in protest today.
I would be really hesitant to say that like, either Eisen-Martin's or Bonney's work had the same impact that McKay's poem had, even if they are showing up at various moments graffitied on something, just because poetry's changed and the culture's changed and this relationship to poetry has changed. I like that you're saying that it's a form of escapism, which I think is like what that work kind of wants to be, right? It wants to uphold, it wants to give us a possibility of an escape from whatever you want to call this moment that we're in, neoliberal or not. Yeah, Kansas State College. It is a reminder that New York is full of graduate students. I mean, they too have their right to the uplift or something. Like, I mean, I don't want to, like, I've never, like, it doesn't mean that's like a bad category or something.
I was thinking that the If We Must Die poem is very revealing in the context of African American history, because traditionally speaking, the justification for enslavement, building on older theories of the notion of the slave, held that slaves are those who are unwilling to die to protect their autonomy. For someone to write a poem, if we must die, let's die defiantly, is in some ways an allusion to that tradition. It says explicitly that we are not enslaved, that we're capable of putting our lives at stake to repudiate this notion of subordination, that we serve or that we're inferior to those who wish to kill us or to enslave us. So it feels to me like protest and riot and If We Must Die are all embedded in a logic that leads back to all these other histories. And I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, I think of those, I mean, I sometimes think of that Kieta poem and the McKay poem as very much similar to Shelley's Mask of Anarchy, and that moment which kind of begins to establish what the political poem does. Right, they're far away. It opens in Italy. It kind of goes through a very specific inventorying of something. It kind of like has a moment where it represents the kind of the kind of like uprising in some form. And I don't know. I don't know enough about like where that like who would have read where that went, right? Where does that Shelley poem, or where does the Mask of Anarchy, how does it carry forward? Who reads it as it goes forward in some sense to kind of establish that convention? But it feels like so close there, in kind of interesting ways. And when you put them in dialogue, they become really kind of fascinating around like what that poem wants to do, what Fanon wants that poem to do, what Shelley thinks, right? It's that way that you kind of like, no one can figure out, does Shelley really want, is it a defense of, going in front and being trampled, or, is there a kind of a resistant subtext within it, right? There's like all these kinds of like interesting questions that kind of show up around that.
What I was thinking about with this is the moments in these poems that you've selected that seem to me to be taking us away from a space of the kind of active, social, connected mass of the riot itself, and to something more quiet and often quite still, and that prize a kind of ethics of care. Often in the way that we've talked about poetry in the Commons so far, or in the Commons generally, we've talked quite a lot about ecological care and slightly less about sort of interpersonal moments of care. So I was thinking about the revolutionary letter you said. It's kind of charmingly pragmatic. Like no liquor with barbiturates. There's a point late in the poem where she says she's like offering tea, ginger compresses, sea salt. There's something like, it's very like homeopathic, as many of the poems in this section are. It reminds me a little bit of the end of the Brooks poem, like the moment of kind of pause and connection. She says that like she can't bear an interruption. And then my final sort of loosely connected thought in this unwieldy string of thoughts was when I was reading your printout of the Sean Bonney poem. I realized I've seen this a million times in the last couple of years on social media, but I very rarely see it with its title and its subtitle, a nursery rhyme. Mm-hmm. And there's a sort of, is it just like ironic because this is not at all, but like I wonder if we can take that nursery rhyme seriously. I like the idea that this is like the most caring language you can imagine, mm-hmm. most soothing language is fuck the police. So I wonder if we can talk a bit more about poetry in the Commons as a site of care, as a practice of care.
I think the only thing that I might have to say is there's a tendency to juxtapose militancy and care as oppositional. And it's really interesting to think about the way that militancy can be a form of care, right? The way that you can go and you could say that like the barricade or the occupation is as much a space of militancy as it is a space of taking care, right? Which is why it's full of like communal childcare, and there's a community kitchen, and there's this and there's that are all about kind of like taking care of people, in which like the very act of obstruction has care built within it in some form, which is a nice way to think about it, which I think is a nice way to kind of think about those poems also, right? That they would tell you that that you don't that you can't think of these things as oppositional, right? Like that they're both connected, that that to care from something might also mean destroying the terrible things that are preventing this care from actually manifesting in some way, which is probably like an overly romantic view of it.
No, I just think it's brilliant to talk about militancy as care, and that's just totally fucking brilliant. That's exactly what it is. And I think there's some comments in Che Guevara and Slavoj Žižek and other communists on the nature of care in revolutionary traditions, for sure. So, and that may be what Frantz Fanon is getting at with the new humanism. You know, instead of apologizing for the humanism there, we could say that within the radical tradition there is humanism, there's also non-humanism, right? There are all kinds of different things. They don't have to be exclusive. The way that a poem can register the oppression of people and the oppression of non-human animals and ecosystems at the same time, which several of these poems do, which is accurate and true and fair, happens in John Clare, happens in these poems. So caring for other people and caring for the planet, they make sense because the oppression comes from the same place. Yeah,
that's interesting. I mean, what do you think about that new humanism, Harris?
So we talked about it yesterday. We traced it from like M.N. Roy's version of it when he leaves the Communist Party in India in 1946, 47, and towards Fanon. And so what's interesting to me is precisely how much like ideological kind of like ambivalence is in a kind of Cold War Marxist humanist terms of various kinds. They can do a lot. They can do all kinds of slippery things, basically. But I think that the way that Dave just described something that like a kind of revolutionary care that would be in like would be in fascismo, or like that sort of thing would be that kind of makes sense to me as what Fanon is on about, because it all is within the like psychoaffective affirmations of the revolutionary project, right? So it's about recuperating and redeeming that kind of affirmative affective relationship to revolution as the constitution of a national culture for him, which I think is an interesting proxy. It's like a kind of problematic but interesting proxy for like common or community national culture for him. So that I'm still trying to figure out, but it's really interesting to think this problem. Yeah.
It's that Che Guevara essay on the new man that emerges. That might actually be another place to think about it, which I haven't read in years.
I think he's basically taking that from Fanon, who's reading closely. Yeah, but you see the new man. That the new man is like a kind of like an anti-colonial topos that like just that spreads virally right at that moment. Yeah.
I have a question which feels a little simple. I feel like maybe I'm just kind of misunderstanding something, but my question is about, I guess, temporality or just the time scale here. And I'm thinking, I guess, about the Bonnie poem and the nursery rhyme. And Juliana, I wasn't quite sure. I think I just didn't understand how you were reading the "For I Love You, Say Fuck the Police." Is it that for now we have to say fuck the police, but eventually we'll be able to say "I love you" again? At one moment I thought that's what you were saying. Like we got to get rid of the bad stuff, and so that the good stuff can come back. Or is it always both, right? In other words, is it not that there's a kind of revolutionary temporality here in which eventually the good stuff will emerge, but rather we're always going to be having to say kind of "I love you" and "fuck the police" at the same time. Like that's just the state of things. So part of this is that there was an argument about love, I think, in relationship to the Brooks poem that you were making, that I felt like I would just like to hear you on that a little bit more, because I felt like I wasn't totally following it. But I've also just, yeah, again, just got the question about, like, in terms of the commons, if we want to think of it in those terms, is the commons the thing that comes back or that reemerges in a new form after we've gotten rid of the police? Or is the commons the ability to say, I love you and fuck the police at the same time? And that's just kind of where we are.
That's a good question. I mean, I read it as the second, kind of like that every like these range of words, right? From I love you to tall skinny latte, require every moment we have to remember that that the police are a problem in some way, and that we can't escape it into like into other spaces. And maybe in that way it's not like the Brooks poem as much, in which it kind of feels like there is like she wants to remind us that you can have this violent polyvocal space, and there's still underneath it a kind of love poem space that that heals you and brings you back in some way, which is kind of how I've read that. But I haven't really, I mean, I'm not even sure I know entirely what Brooks wants to do other than make us have a lot of thoughts, which it seems like that's the only way that I can kind of like read that ending, is like it's just supposed to be like we have to think about what we do with our moments of intimacy and these great, we can't deny them in these public moments, and or something like that would be how I would kind of read it.
The stanza from If We Must Die was quoted in the Time magazine story about the Attica rebellion, and it's described as clandestine writing. Among them was a poem written by an unknown prisoner, crude but touching in its would-be heroic style. And then, so Gwendolyn Brooks writes a letter to the editor on the 18th of October saying, please tell the poetry specialist who gave us the above that his find is a portion of one of the most famous poems ever written, known to Hitler, elementary school children, to say nothing of Winston Churchill. The poem is entitled If We Must Die, and the Black poet is Claude McKay. And then she quotes the poem itself. So there was a misreading of the poem, a misrecognition of it, and then she corrects the paper of record, the magazine of record, and that's exactly in this historical moment.
I don't know how to. I'm not quite sure how to put this. I think it's kind of just a pretty elementary or dumb question, but I've just been struck by. I've been sort of stuck, Juliana, when you mentioned the sort of social forms that you thought we could be talking about. You said commons, but you were also thinking about riots, and you use the word insurrection, which, you know, is kind of a word. And I thought about, and it becoming the word that people are using to describe January 6th too was sort of a weird moment. And I remember thinking, is that the right word, or does it dignify it somehow? Or would it be better to call it a farce, or does it actually give it the right kind of seriousness? But all those questions, I guess, about nomenclature for these kinds of things were raised for me when you mentioned that. And I just was, in a related vein, I guess, I've been noticing how many, you draw our attention to the fact of the importance of all these shifters, the we's and the you's in these poems, in the sense of, that we've been talking about the you being a love you or an oppositional you too. It seems like I can't remember now if the first part of the Brooks poem calls John Cabot a you or not, but it seems to have that energy of sort of imagining the person against whom the riot is directed. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out, like, is this tradition in any way guaranteed to be on the good side? I
mean, I don't know. I mean, I've had all those same thoughts when the word insurrection started getting used there. I was like, oh, there's that word that we normally use to talk about, a different sort of moment in some way. And it's kind of interesting around it. And I mean, we have seen, I mean, we're in a weird, it's such a weird moment in so many ways. Like, there's so many of these moments that have been really, really complicated politically, right? And these, the way that literature functions in the United States is that it's a liberal or left of liberal in most instances from the 20th century, although not entirely, right? I mean, there is that kind of great Wilbur poem where he's like, stop causing all the trouble and go talk to those people. The kind of grumpy one that he writes around the student stuff in this, I think it's probably in the 68 era in some way. Can't remember the exact year, but there's something around that I don't really know kind of like what it would what that means or something. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a legitimate question. Is like, I mean, we've seen a lot of kind of uprisings that have really troubled politics, and I don't think we can say that. I mean, it's a form of that it's a form of a talk, and that that Martin Luther King one that Gwendolyn Brooks quotes of the language of the unheard. There's a lot of unheards that are using that a kind of uprising form right now, and we're kind of in a moment of interesting change around it.
Okay, well, I think we've come close to it. Does anyone have some closing synthesizing thoughts, bringing it all together? I do think we're still worrying about the scale of the commons, the locality of the commons and generalizability. These are questions we've been working with really all semesters. So it's nice to have deepened those conversations here. And just wanted, pardon, question?
Oh, I just wanted, no, that's just Colin. I just wanted to say, and the capacity of language, and it's particularly in the particularly compressed form that we know as poetry, to as Joanna said, starting us off last week, to move into the indicative, right? I mean, that's been for me one of the really fruitful and interesting questions from this group.
Thank you.
Yes, and thanks so much for our speakers and everybody who participated. Really rich conversations. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.